Hello everybody and welcome to this second webinar on FHIR-related IHE profiles organized by HL7 Finland. And as before, our expert in this matter is John Moehrke. So John, please take it away.
So hello, I figure I'll put myself on camera for a little bit, just to say, hello to everyone. So what we're going to be going through today is patient identity management profiles from IHE, focusing on the FHIR ones. So let me share my screen. So again, we start at the publication site, profiles.ihe.net. And if you go down to the IT infrastructure, you get to the various things that we're doing. And then at the top of the IT infrastructure are these topics. We're going to be working through this patient identity management. But you can see, this is where you'll find the final text, technical framework, current public comments, and the supplements that are in trial implementation, which everything we're going to talk about today is supplements in trial implementation. Within patient identity management, this is a part of that HIE white paper, but it's really applicable to all of the patient identity management. Just want to kind of give you a quick view here because it kind of shows all of them in some kind of a context. So we have this table that shows PDQ family, the PIXm family, XCPD, and the PMIR family. So if you want a quick view of what is the general architecture and what are the use cases, that's kind of there. They are described a little bit below, but I'm not going to use those. We're going to go to presentations. So first up, I'm going to go into PDQm. I'm reusing presentations. This one was presented by Spencer, who was the last one to do some updates to PDQm. That update was to add the FHIR dollar match as an option. So the presentation will focus on that, but I'll touch upon everything. So PDQm is this family, I'll say, of patient demographics query. So this originally started a long time ago using HL7 V2 back in the days when HL7 V2 was all there was. And this gave the ability of a client to search for patient identities that they could then use in the HL7 messaging. PDQ V2, I'll say V2, is still used in many places just because it's compact and they have that technology. During the HL7 V3 phases, we created a PDQ V3, which essentially took the HL7 V3 and profiled it for the exact same use cases. So it was a reimagining of that original PDQ into, well, how would you do that original use case with a HL7 V3? V3 is fading, but it's still out there. It is both PDQ and PDQ V3 are normative specs. We then, when FHIR was coming forward and becoming interesting to many, we started with PDQm. It was the first one we looked at using FHIR. And at that point, since we had this pattern of PDQ V3, we figured, well, there needs to be some suffix to show that this is the original use cases reimagined using FHIR in this case. We used the term mobile at the time. Haven't found a better word, but I do regret using the term mobile. But the intent of mobile is to say, well, if you have mobile apps that have to engage those mobile apps really cannot use the heaviness of V3. They really can't use the oddness of V2. So they have a RESTful stack. They have JSON. So the difference in PDQm is because we want to be able to address these mobile applications. That doesn't mean that you can't use it in Big Iron. You certainly can. It just means that the constraint is for uses that have a more restricted set of tools. We did this so long ago that this was using FHIR DSTU 0.08. We are now at R4, and we are probably going to be at R4 until R6 comes out. We have not seen much demand overall for R5, and it's just easier to not focus on that. So the new thing, and I'm going to start with the new thing, is this dollar match operation. The original PDQm used the FHIR RESTful search technology, and we used query parameters, and many pushed back on that, saying, well, if you're using FHIR RESTful search, I have to, as a server, follow the RESTful spec, and I can't be creative about how I apply things. Now, we tried to explain that, well, actually you are allowed to take a name and name parameter and apply a fuzzy name match to it. But it's just not as obvious on either the client or the server with an HTTP RESTful query. So dollar match operation enables us to say, well, just have the client send everything that it has. It doesn't have to think about what it wants to provide. It just says, well, this is everything I have. The server then has more flexibility to apply search capabilities. The server can focus in on just one thing. It can focus in on a bunch of things. It can rank them. It can do all kinds of matching. Could be fuzzy matching, could be probabilistic matching. So this enables the server to be more powerful, if you will, and from that point, the client just provides what it knows, and it gets back an identity. So you have on the left the patient search. This is a RESTful query. This is the original transaction. If you have those needs, it still is there. It didn't go away. So some of the things that you might use it for instead of dollar match is, hey, you have an identity, you want to look it up, or you know a specific piece of information about the patient and you want to look it up, or you want to be able to look up a group of patients, so all the Moehrkes. Whereas dollar match would be used, when you want to get a single answer, when you have automated workflows that can't deal with getting back multiple results, those kinds of things, and where you want to allow the server to be more heuristic. So this is where PDQm lives. It's on the profiles at IHE.net that I was just showing. The QR code, I believe, does work. It is in trial implementation. You can still submit public comments. So I just want to stress, if you have a improvement opportunity or you see a bug, by all means, go ahead and put those in. So that's PDQm. Next up, I'm going to go quickly through PIXm. So again, I'm reusing slides. So this was originally presented by Oliver when we most recently updated it. Oh dear, I thought I turned that off. As you can see, Oliver is very consistent. No, I don't. I really thought I turned that off. Oh, I'll bet I poked on it, didn't I? Interesting. So it just doesn't automatically start. No. All right. So PIXm, again, it started a long time ago as PIX, Patient Identity Cross-Referencer. It was based on HL7 V2. We created a V3 along the way. And of course, we then looked at when FHIR comes along, well, how do we do PIX with FHIR? PIX is different, almost counter to PDQ in that PIX, the client only provides an identifier and the server only provides absolute matches to those identifiers. So in PIX, you are providing an identifier and getting back an identifier. You might use PIX because you're not allowed to see demographics. You might use PIX because you're not allowed to send demographics. You're not allowed to, expose to the server that the demographics. You might use it just because you have a automatic need to cross-reference and you don't have any user interface involved. Oh, no. Okay. So within PIXm, there are three actors. The patient identity source, which provides that's kind of the registry, registry desk, if you will, that system that's the owner of the identities, and they're sending them to the cross-reference manager, which is doing cross-reference. So generally speaking, in a PIX environment, you have many different identity sources. Think of a health information exchange where you have 20 organizations involved in this affinity domain. All those 20 would each be identity sources feeding their identities to one manager. The manager would be doing algorithmic matching. Hopefully it can do very definitive matching. And then a cross-reference consumer is some client who has an identity, probably from their organization, and they want to know what is the identity that this other organization uses or that the health information exchange uses. So those are the use cases that are across all of the PIXs. And then in PIXm, we've added a remove patient option. Let's see if I can. All right, so we have two transactions in PIXm. The first one we published PIXm with is just this cross-reference query. The second is this identity feed. So this is the new thing that this presentation is pointing out, is that there's now a feed transaction in PIXm to support adding or revising a patient, resolving duplicates, or removing patients. So the ITI 83, so the query, if you will, is a operation. So because it's an identifier for an identifier, we couldn't use FHIR RESTful searches. And it was easier to just profile an operation to say, hey, put in the identifiers, and response back is the identifiers that were cross-referenced. The feed is based on a FHIR R4 conditional update. So it's a bundle of conditional updates. All right, so I don't think there's anything on this slide that is all that important to present. So this is where the PIXm specification lives. As with the other, you know, it does have some open issues. It has some questions. It has the history of changes is in the issues page. And then, you know, you can see from there how to provide comments. And there's often discussions in the IHE stream over on Zulip. So that's the PIXm. And at this point, you know, is there questions about PDQm or PIXm? I'm going to somewhat cover them a little bit more in the PMIR, but PMIR is a shift away from those fundamental client-server use cases.
Some questions, but I'm totally happy to ask them at the end once you've gone through all the profiles. From my point of view, please continue, but others,
okay,
please.
I'll continue and we'll give you an opportunity at the end.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's go with this one. I believe I have narrations off, so PMIR, like I said, is different than the other ones in that patient master identity registry is setting up a use case of an environment that has a need to have a patient identity registry. So it's not just a cross-reference, it's actually the registry of what is the current known demographics for this patient and what is the identity that everyone will use. This is usually kind of something I would recommend for greenfields where you don't have a V2 or a V3 or an XCPD environment. You have an environment that doesn't have an identity system, and you can support a golden patient. So this is trying to set up a golden patient in some central registry. The size of that domain might be just an organization. So you might use this within an organization, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, well, how would I create a health information exchange around MHD, but have a patient identity management system that doesn't have to have cross-references. So in this way, you know, we're using FHIR to have a complete patient identity management system. So this profile has three actors: a patient identity consumer, patient identity subscriber, and a patient identity manager. And it reuses patient identity source, patient demographics consumer, and patient identity cross-reference consumer from the PDQm and PIXm. So this PMIR orchestrates into PMIR the PIXm and PDQm. So we didn't have to recreate where those actors and those transactions already existed. The supplement defines this identity feed within this environment that is managing the golden patient, and therefore, you know, it's got abilities to updates, it's got abilities to subscribe. I'll show that on the next slide a little bit better. And then it, like I said, it reuses PDQm. So on the left is patient demographics consumer doing an ITI 78. That's PDQm. That's treating the patient identity registry as the source, the server, if you will, in a PDQm environment. On the far left, the patient identity cross-reference consumer is PIXm, where the server is the patient identity registry. So in this way, you know, you can see that clients just need to follow the PIXm or PDQm profiles. They don't need to know that they're talking to PMIR versus they're talking to something else, right? So that's kind of the left-hand side. The top side there with the patient identity source is, much like the identity source in PIXm, except that in this case, we're adding business logic that says that if you're going to feed updates to the identity registry, you have to be an authorized identity source that knows that you must not add duplicate identities. So we do add the deduplication responsibility to the source in this case, which means the patient identity source, when a new person shows up and the person's doing data entry as to what is your demographics, they do need to search, probably using the dollar match, to see that this patient doesn't already exist. If they already exist, well, is there any changes? If there's changes, then the feed would include an update. If they don't exist, then the feed would include a create. So it's a rather simple concept, but the idea is that the patient identity source in this case is responsible to make sure that the golden patient at the identity registry is as singular as possible. We do recognize that sometimes multiple identifiers, multiple identities get created, so we do have a merge. We do have a delete, those kinds of things. And then on the right and bottom are two pairs that work together, the patient identity consumer and the patient identity subscriber. These might be various systems within the domain that need to know about identities, but don't want to do a query. So they want to be fed the information. So these probably are servers, EHRs or PHRs, or some kind of a server that wants to maintain its own identities. So it can subscribe to updates, and then it will get those updates. These subscriptions and updates are not using the new subscription model that's in FHIR. We wrote this back when that new subscription model didn't exist yet. So this is using the FHIR R4 subscription model, and the feed is a FHIR messaging feed. So it may seem somewhat backwards from that perspective, but be aware it still is functional. We do have on the books that we should update that to the new, but we haven't yet had enough call to just update that to the new subscription model. So what does it use? The feed, like I said, is a FHIR R4 message. The subscribe and update is the RESTful subscription from R4, and the queries are PDQm or PIXm queries. Oh yeah, I guess I don't have the link to where that one exists, but I can certainly show that within the. So, like I said, the PMIR you'll find down here, and PIXm and PDQm. So these three are what I have just presented. And then, these are all IG publisher publications, so they all have the volume 1 narrative that IHE uses for describing the use case, volume 2 with the transactions, the artifacts are here. In many cases, we have a test plan that's linked. This case with PIXm, with PMIR, we don't have that linkage, but with like PDQ, we have a strong linkage to the Gazelle managed. So here, I show off a good test plan. So this one here has a strong linkage to the how is this tested. So That is the topic covered. So now, Mikhail, we can take some questions.
Thank you. I'll start with the one from Kari in chat. Do you have any information about how widely these profiles are used in EU, instead of relying and or requiring use of some national citizen identifier system?
So, no, I don't, because I generally have a really poor feedback, so I don't really know what's going on. One of the things that I will note is national IDs are great things to use with these. So within the patient, there's a patient identifier, and you would put your national ID in as one of those identifiers. In that way, you can always do a query based on your national ID and get, what is the FHIR patient.id that you could then use everywhere else. So national IDs are very good for that. But I don't know to what extent these are used, or the other patient identity alternatives. I just don't have that knowledge.
Yeah, I had the same question. I also have the feeling that an operation like match is not so important in places like Finland, where we have the universal personal
Correct.
identifier. And
yeah, I expect
heavily,
that something like PIXm would be, far more used. I will say that one of the other things that one of the other identity management systems that we have is this XCPD. So this is it's based on HL7 V3, but the idea here is that it allows you to federate your search. It's kind of like a dollar match that's federated out to all of the participants in a health exchange or cross-community exchange, but it's using HL7 V3. Have been some discussion about creating a M version of this that probably leverages something like dollar match, but we haven't gotten there yet. But yeah, I would agree, Mikhail, where you have a national ID, much better to search on the national ID. That way you get an absolute match and you're not exposing demographics unnecessarily.
However, then when we extend that beyond country borders, then we have different national identifiers. For instance, in the Nordics, in all the Nordic countries, we have that, but implementations don't necessarily accept the identifier from the neighboring country. So what would be your advice there?
You would use that in an XCPD, right? You would say, hey, this is the identity I know. Yep.
However, when I think of that, I think that many of the use cases are in healthcare, but even more are outside healthcare. And probably within the EU, we need some EUDI, European Digital Identity, kind of cross-referencing model anyway.
Yeah, I would agree.
And all of the standards that we are using here are essentially from the healthcare realm, or kind of bottom layer probably is not. There are some really universal stuff, but then there is CDA V2, V3, and FHIR. That's somewhere in these standards.
Yeah, from an identifier perspective, so a FHIR patient identifier, you could put any kind of an identifier in there. So if you've got a driver's license, if you've got a passport number, anything can go in there, and that's a can go in there. Whether it's legit, use of that identifier is a good question. So for a while there in the US, the Social Security number was used. Well, that was determined, no, that's not an appropriate use of that value. So all of a sudden now all of those have to be scrubbed out. So, you know, the identifier field can hold any kind of an identifier, including some of the things I've been pushing, including your user identifier. So many people have a social media identifier that they want to stand in for their positive identifier. You could put that into the patient.identifier, and if somebody ever queries on that as an identifier, they'll get a positive match.
Yes. Kari has a second one. Does IHE, perhaps IHE Europe, already have, or is it going to have some work targeting European eIDAS, electronic identification and trust services, i.e. having and using digital identity certificates in your mobile, and issues especially relevant for FHIR, healthcare services, etc.?
Again, I don't know what's going on in IHE EU or even HL7 EU, so I would hope the answer is yes, but I don't. I'm not an authority there.
Yeah, let's ask that question somewhere else. About the others, Timo, Anssi, any questions, any thoughts?
I came a little late because of the previous meeting, so that first one was the most interesting to me, but I missed the start of this unfortunately, so I need to see the recording.
Luckily, we do have the recording.
Yes,
and you have the opportunity to say what you were expecting John to cover, and then we can make sure that we covered that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It looks to be all the profiles, and the first one looked the most interesting.
Yeah.
Because this, of course, this match is like we have discussed. We have this national patient ID, so for most use cases we use that.
Yep. Yeah, I wish more would have that, but yeah. I agree.
Of course, in Finland we also have challenges with temporary user identities and those who move from other countries. And then what comes to this cross-referencing, so what came to my mind, maybe it was the same as you, Mikael, that if we had more cooperation in the Nordic countries or whatever. For example, I have also a Swedish ID because I was living in Sweden. And now I was a little worried about that. Hey, what will happen to my, how do you call it, when I retire? You get some money from Sweden, and I don't remember my national ID in Sweden, which is a little different. So, but maybe that's a normal case, but we don't have any concrete cases, I think, at the moment of such cross-border need at the moment.
But we will have soon when IPS starts to spread. I think that's a really good example that even the same EU citizen might have several different identifiers from different countries.
Yes.
Yep. Well, and that's where this XCPD comes in. So that this is intended to cross those community borders. So you would send, again, it's like I said, it's what I presented on the dollar match. It's very much like dollar match in that you gather up what you know and you're allowed to expose, and you send that query off throughout the federation of systems. And there are ways to target that, but essentially it allows an organization to say, hey, I know this is, you know, the Finland ID. Do you know the cross-reference to Sweden? So that's what that one is intended to support, and that's where you get to these, you know, cross-border exchanges like the XCA cross-border exchange of an IPS.
So do you want to talk shortly about the XCPD? What's that origin? Is it V2, V3?
Yeah, XCPD is unfortunately it's HL7 V3 based. So it's one of the problems we're coming up against now is how do we maintain it? But it's such a very, very focused profiling of HL7 V3. You could implement it without ever knowing that you were implementing HL7 V3. It is SOAP based. It is therefore XML based. It is the authorization is SAML based, which is what the cross community environment is based on, is this federatable SAML identities. So XCPD, is what's used. And actually, what I'll say is most implementations don't even realize that they're using XCPD. They just know they're using a patient discovery mechanism.
And if we really wanted to, we could, I bet, rework that to work with something like OpenID and JSON. But again, not sure that it's worth it, especially in the healthcare domain alone. I'm sure we need something in Europe to help us figure out how different country IDs, organizational IDs map, but not necessarily a healthcare.
I very much expect that IHE is going to need to create a XCPD equivalent that uses FHIR. It's just something that we need enough interest in because we don't create profiles that nobody is interested in. So if you're interested, please make sure you participate in ITI or let your contact know. But yeah, the idea of being able to do federation of FHIR queries is something that we are hearing there's interest, but there's not a lot of interest coming forward. Fact is, HL7 and IHE have teamed up in a Gemini project to address that kind of a point of, well, if you have many domains of data, patient identities would be one, how do you federate a search across those that supports things like we've had to support in XCPD and XCA. So again, even if you combine HL7 and IHE on a project, we haven't been able to pull together enough people to get a work group discussing how to solve these. So very interested, but I don't want to be, producing another white paper like Graham already produced, which is here are all the problems. We need those who are have a stake in it and who will be implementing it to help with decisions. Do we go to the A path or the B path? Because once you make that decision, you're locking something in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there is a use. I think it will probably happen. But XCPD works today. One of the things I have pointed out is XCPD can communicate FHIR IDs. So you can use XCPD to discover the FHIR ID in a different community and then just do a FHIR RESTful search based on that ID. So there are ways to use XCPD to kickstart a FHIR point-to-point.
Just a question here, just to make sure. When you refer to FHIR ID, are you referring to an identifier, business identifier, or resource ID?
Resource ID.
Okay.
Yeah. Ultimately, when you get to doing the FHIR RESTful interactions, so create, read, update, delete, you have to be doing that based on an ID value. So if you have a business identifier, you have to convert that business identifier into an ID. And
Yep.
PDQm, PIXm, and as I point out, XCPD can do that. And then once you have an ID, you know what the server is, because it's the root of the ID, and you know the ID at that server. So now you can turn and say, okay, now give me the vital signs given this patient ID at this service endpoint. And you can use directories, federation of directories, if you have different endpoints, and to make known, the authorization mechanisms, those kinds of things. But now we're getting way off.
Yeah, but it's still really interesting. Kari says in chat, I think these profiles might surface in the EU once EHDS, the European Health Data Space, gets actually going and there are more services available. The other use case I'm thinking of is that we have initial discussion within the Nordic countries of framing a Nordic implementation guide for the smart app launch or for IPA, the International Patient Access Specification.
Yep.
And for that, we would need to talk something about identity management, identification, authentication. We already have some plans that, yes, we all have these banks and mobile operators who help currently do that, and also governmental services where you can log in and that they give you identity, but all of those are or
I certainly don't have any forbiddens. That would be kind of a business rule that would say, how volatile is the search. In reality, many times, whether you're doing any of these searches, the identifier, you take this trade-off, right? You can save the identifier and reuse it, but you risk missing something that has changed over time. So if between the last time you queried and the time you're using it is 5 years, you might end up not working with the right identifier. You might be working with a retired identifier. So yeah, the question of caching is really more of a business decision as to how volatile is the system, how volatile is the search criteria. So yeah, from an IHE perspective, we just simply say, hey, here's the query, and effectively from that perspective, it's expected you always do it, but of course you won't. You'll do it once per day, or once per session, or what have you.
great. Any other questions? Timo, do you want to just introduce yourself? Timo is the chair of the technical committee of HL7 Finland. You're muted. We can see you, but not hear.
Okay, how about now?
There you go.
better.
Okay, yeah. Okay, my name is Timo Kaskinen, and I'm the co-chair of our technical committee. It was nice listening to you. I was also multitasking here, something else, but I have to listen your story once again once we get this recording live. But nice to meet you.
Yep. Good to meet you all.
Any final questions? There's still time. Of course, we know that we can also find John on Zulip, for instance.
Yep. On Zulip, honestly, you can contact me anytime. I enjoy helping people out, and my usual, I will. If you ask me a very good question, I will end up posting the answer updated on my blog. So, you know, you'll notice here I've been asked a lot about attribute-based access control. So my most recent posts are about that.
It's also a valuable resource. Thanks for keeping that up.
Yep. All right.
All right, let's stop here. I'll stop the recording, and we can still stay on. We should discuss about the future episodes.
Okay.
But for anybody else, let's catch up later.